They say the Bible begins with "in the beginning," but what if the beginning we know isn't the real beginning? There exists a book, buried, forgotten, and removed from the canon, that tells a different story. A story with exact dates, structured years, and a cosmic calendar that runs deeper than anything found in Genesis. It's called the Book of Jubilees. Most people have never heard of it. Fewer still have read it. And yet, this one text quietly rewrites everything from the moment of creation to the coming of the final judgment. According to Jubilees, time itself was not random. It didn't move with chaos. It followed a precise divine rhythm. 7 cycles of 7, a sacred pattern, a hidden timeline. Imagine being told that the events of Genesis didn't just happen. They were scheduled. That every generation, every flood, every war, every covenant was marked on an invisible clock. And this clock wasn't human. It was celestial. So why was this book erased? Why was a sacred scroll that was once treated as divine, read aloud, studied, and preserved by the most ancient of scribes, completely removed from the Bible you know today? Was it heresy? Or was it too true? In the Book of Jubilees, angels aren't just background characters. They're timekeepers, witnesses, recorders of human history. One angel, in particular, descends from heaven and gives Moses a new version of the past, one that includes names, years, and moments left out of Genesis. And this isn't just about filling in gaps. It's about changing the order of the story. Cain and Abel, Noah's Ark, the Tower of Babel, the fall of the Watchers. Jubilees places them all on a clock, measured, counted, predicted. And here's where it gets even stranger. This timeline doesn't just look backward, it reaches forward. It hints at events that hadn't yet happened when it was written: wars, exiles, and even the coming of a final age. Some say the predictions mirror events in the Book of Revelation. Others believe it exposes secrets humanity was never supposed to know. But the deeper you go into the Book of Jubilees, the more one question keeps rising. What else have we been reading out of order all this time? Because if this hidden calendar is real, then everything we thought was spontaneous was actually part of a plan. Every fall, every rise, every curse, every blessing, mapped out before the world began. The priests knew it, the scribes knew it, even the early Christians debated it, but somewhere along the way, it vanished. And now it returns, not as myth, but as a threat to the version of the Bible we were taught to trust. So before we go deeper, ask yourself, can a single forgotten scroll really shift the foundation of divine history, or has it already? The Book of Jubilees begins not with a tale, but with a revelation. It claims that high above Mount Sinai, just after the 10 Commandments were given, an angel came to Moses. But this wasn't any ordinary angel. He wasn't sent to warn or punish or bless. He was sent to remind. This angel brings with him a second layer of scripture. Not commandments, but history, a detailed account of everything that had ever happened, from the creation of the world to the birth of Moses himself. And not just the events, but their exact timing, laid out in cycles, measured in jubilees. 1 jubilee equals 49 years. 7 times 7, sacred time. The book calls itself the Little Genesis, because in many ways it mirrors the stories we already know from the Book of Genesis. But here's the twist. These stories come with dates, with structure, with divine chronology. It's like seeing the same story, but this time through the eyes of heaven. So where did this mysterious book come from? Most scholars trace the oldest versions back over 2,000 years, to around the 2nd century BCE. It was likely written in Hebrew, although only fragments remain in that language. What survives today mostly comes from Ethiopic translations, which were preserved not in Rome or Jerusalem or Constantinople, but in the ancient Christian communities of Ethiopia. Why there? Because while the Western Church erased it, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church considered Jubilees part of its official biblical canon. For them, it was never a side story, it was scripture. That's where things start to get strange. Why would one part of the world consider it sacred and another reject it completely? Some say it was too rigid. too obsessed with dates, purity laws, and angelic hierarchies. Others believe it conflicted with Christian theology. Jubilees has no mention of the coming Messiah, no predictions about Jesus. It leans heavily into the law of Moses and warns repeatedly against Gentile nations who would corrupt the sacred calendar. To some early Christian leaders, this made it dangerous, because Jubilees wasn't just another version of Genesis. It was a book that insisted, with clarity and authority, that the world was designed to follow God's clock, a calendar of purity, of discipline, of divine judgment. That kind of precision left no room for reinterpretation. And that's not all. Jubilees also gives voice to characters who are barely mentioned in the Standard Bible. The Watchers, those angels who fell from heaven and taught forbidden knowledge. The Nephilim, giants born of their union with human women. These beings aren't hinted at. They are central to the story. Jubilees explains the flood not just as punishment for human sin, but as a necessary purge to rid the earth of corrupted DNA, to erase the children of the Watchers. Think about that. In just a few extra chapters, Jubilees turns the Genesis flood into a supernatural war cleanup. Not just moral, but cosmic. So who wrote this? Most scholars believe it was authored by a Jewish priestly group during the time of the Second Temple, a time when Jerusalem was caught between powerful empires, when questions of identity, purity, and survival consumed every debate. And this group, likely part of the Essenes or a similar sect, sought to preserve their version of truth, a truth anchored in sacred time. They believed the world was falling out of rhythm, that the true calendar of God was being lost. So they wrote the Book of Jubilees to fix it, to realign the sacred timeline, to protect the covenant through precise memory. But over time, their influence faded, and the book faded with them. When Christian scribes later copied, canonized, and organized scripture, Jubilees was nowhere to be found. It was too Jewish, too legalistic, too stubbornly aligned with a version of time that didn't match the new vision of salvation. So it was cut, buried, labeled as pseudepigrapha, a false writing, a forgery of holy history, and yet it never truly disappeared. Because in caves near Qumran, fragments of Jubilees were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, the most sacred texts of an isolated Jewish sect. And in the highlands of Ethiopia, the full book was kept safe for centuries, copied by hand, preserved by faith. So ask yourself, if this book was so dangerous, why was it ever written? And if it was false, why preserve it at all? Maybe the better question is, what part of its message made people so afraid? We'll explore that in the next chapter, when we dive into the hidden cosmic calendar revealed in Jubilees. Imagine standing at the foot of Mount Sinai, the air still, the stones hot beneath your feet, and the sky pulsing with divine energy. We all know the story. Moses climbs the mountain to receive the Ten Commandments. But there's another story, but by your own, a story buried deeper, one that doesn't appear in the Bible most of us grew up with. It begins with an angel, not just any angel, but a heavenly scribe, a messenger of memory. He comes not to deliver new laws, but to reveal an ancient record, one that he says has always existed in heaven. This angel tells Moses, "Write down what I tell you, for these are the words written on the heavenly tablets." That phrase, heavenly tablets, echoes like thunder. It means this isn't just a vision, it's not a dream, it's a direct transmission from the divine archive, a cosmic record of time, events, and decisions made before the world even began. But who is this angel? The Book of Jubilees never names him directly. But in ancient Jewish tradition, one figure stands out, the angel of the presence. He's mentioned briefly in other scriptures, usually standing near the throne of God. Not a warrior like Michael, not a messenger like Gabriel, but something more subtle. He is the watcher, the recorder, the one who knows the blueprint of creation. Some texts even equate him with Metatron, a mysterious being said to have once been human, transformed into a heavenly scribe. Others believe this angel is a collective voice, a personification of God's memory itself. Whatever the case, this angel does something that no other heavenly being dares to do. He rewrites how we understand the past. He tells Moses about creation, but not as a story in days. Instead, he speaks in jubilees, blocks of 49 years. Every major event, every sacred moment is plotted on this divine calendar. It's like taking the chaotic sweep of human history and snapping it into alignment with cosmic rhythm. Suddenly, we're told not just what happened, but when. Adam wasn't just formed, he was formed in the first week of the first Jubilee. Enoch didn't just walk with God, he did so in the exact year marked on the heavenly timeline. This is not storytelling, it's divine accounting, and it raises a haunting question. Why would an angel, presumably sent by God, care so much about setting the record straight? Unless, unless history itself was in danger. Think about the time when Jubilees was written. Jerusalem was surrounded by foreign empires. Greek philosophies were spreading. Sacred festivals were being replaced by political celebrations. The Jewish people were losing not just their land, but their sense of time. The Book of Jubilees appears as a counterattack. It's a message from above saying, your story is not random. Your past has pattern. Your calendar is sacred. And the angel delivering this message, he isn't just a guide. He's a guardian of divine memory. But there's something more chilling. The angel doesn't just recount history, he edits it. In his version, her version, the roles of certain figures shift. Events appear in new sequences. Laws are emphasized that don't exist in the traditional Torah. It's like being handed a new lens, one that sharpens some details and blurs others. For example, in the angel's telling, the Sabbath is not just a rest day, it becomes the center of cosmic order. Keeping it is not simply obedience, it's alignment with heaven's clock. And there's a deep suspicion toward outsiders. Gentile nations in this telling are almost always cast as corrupters of time, violators of the sacred rhythm. Their calendars are off, their festivals impure, their influence dangerous. It's as if the angel is warning, follow the timeline of heaven or be erased from it. So again, we ask, who was this being? And why does his version of events feel both familiar and unsettling? Is this angel simply restoring lost truth? Or is he correcting history for a people in crisis? Maybe both. In many traditions, angels are not robotic messengers. They are intelligent, conscious, and deeply tied to the will of God. They can deliver judgment. They can alter destiny. And in this case, they can shape memory. The Book of Jubilees suggests something powerful. That time itself is sacred. That memory is not just something we carry, but something we are commanded to preserve. And this angel, he stands at the center of that mission. Not to comfort, but to remind. Not to soften history, but to reveal its structure. He doesn't ask for belief. He demands alignment. And as Moses listens and writes, the question lingers in the air. What happens when divine memory clashes with human tradition? In the next section, we'll follow this timeline the angel reveals and discover how Jubilees reshape stories we thought we knew. Stories of Enoch, Noah, and Abraham into a map of sacred time. But before we go there, hold on to this. Let's go back to the beginning. Not the beginning we were taught, but a beginning that unfolds in exact numbers, precise cycles, and divine rhythm. In the book of Genesis, time feels fluid. Creation happens in 6 days, then comes the Sabbath. Generations pass, events unfold, and before long, humanity spreads across the earth. But in the Book of Jubilees, time isn't just a background, it's a character. It's a sacred grid that determines everything, from creation to covenant, from birth to death. This book introduces a strange and powerful idea. Everything in history happens in cycles of 49 years. These cycles are called Jubilees, 7 sets of 7 years, and each Jubilee marks a divine chapter, a turning point in sacred history. It's as if time, according to Jubilees, isn't measured in years, but in meaning. Take the creation of Adam. In Genesis, it's simple. God formed him from the dust and breathed life into him. But in Jubilees, we're told exactly when it happened. On the 6th day, in the 2nd week of the first Jubilee. The language is precise, mathematical, as if heaven runs on a cosmic calendar. And that calendar doesn't just tell us when events happen, it tells us how they're meant to happen. Because in Jubilees, time itself is moral. There's a right time for everything, and stepping outside of that rhythm is seen as corruption. Now imagine what that does to the rest of the Genesis story. In Jubilees, Enoch, the mysterious man who walked with God, is no longer just a holy figure. He becomes a keeper of the calendar. He writes down heavenly knowledge. He warns humanity to return to the right timing, because the flood is coming. The flood, too, is given an exact date. It begins in the second month, on the 17th day, in a specific Jubilee cycle. It's not random wrath. It's divine correction, scheduled and foretold. Even the covenants, those powerful promises between God and humankind, are placed on this cosmic timeline. When Noah steps off the ark, he doesn't just offer a sacrifice. He marks the beginning of a new Jubilee, a fresh reset in the divine pattern. Later, when Abraham is called, it's not just a moment of faith. It's a timed intervention. He was born in the 6th week of the 19th Jubilee, and his obedience triggers the next phase of the divine plan. Suddenly, everything we know from Genesis, every story, every hero, every fall and redemption, gets repositioned. The chaos becomes choreography. Why? Because to the authors of Jubilees, the world wasn't just created with power. It was created with precision. This structure did more than organize sacred history. It created boundaries. It drew lines around truth and heresy. Inside the calendar was divine order. Outside of it, confusion, corruption, and false tradition. And this was more than theology. It was resistance. Because when the Book of Jubilees was written, Jewish communities were under pressure. Greek ideas of time, fate, and storytelling were spreading. Roman systems were reshaping calendars. Festivals were being overwritten. Sabbath was being challenged. So Jubilees pushed back, with time as its weapon. By remapping Genesis into a structured timeline, it reclaimed the past. It said, we don't follow myths. We follow the original order, the one given by angels, written on heavenly tablets and passed down to Moses. That's why so much of the book reads like a detailed genealogy. Not just who was born, but when. Not just what happened, but at what point in the divine cycle. Even sin and failure are placed on the timeline. Cain's murder of Abel, the fall of the Watchers, those angels who descended to earth, the building of the Tower of Babel. All of it is marked and measured. It's not just history, it's judgment in time. And that raises a question. If every moment was divinely timed, then what does that say about now? What Jubilee are we living in? Are we in sync with the sacred rhythm or drifting further from it? In Genesis, we're given freedom and mystery, but in Jubilees, we're handed a cosmic schedule, one that warns, instructs, and corrects. It might feel rigid, but to those who wrote it, it was a lifeline. It was a way to stay connected when everything around them felt like it was unraveling. And perhaps that's why the book was hidden, because a timeline that rewrites Genesis also rewrites power. And not everyone wanted that, but the Book of Jubilees doesn't flinch. It continues to draw the line between what happened and when, between sacred time and human error. And as we move into the next section, that line becomes even clearer, because it's not just the stories that change, it's the characters. Next, we'll uncover how the Book of Jubilees recasts fallen angels and the giants of old, not as distant myths, but as parts of a divine pattern, a warning written in the very calendar of heaven. In most versions of the Bible, the fall of humanity is a story told in shadows. There's the serpent, there's the fruit, there's the exile from Eden, and then the world begins to unravel. But the Book of Jubilees doesn't leave it in shadows. It brings light, and it brings dates. It tells us exactly when the serpent entered the garden, exactly when Eve listened, exactly when Adam fell. The fall doesn't float in mystery, it lands on the calendar. According to Jubilees, the sin occurred on the 17th day of the second month, a date mirrored later in the story of the flood. It's as if sin and judgment were part of the same rhythm, separated by generations but connected by time. But that's just the beginning. Because where Genesis moves on quietly to Cain and Abel, Jubilees takes a sharp turn. It starts talking about angels, not just messengers from God, but watchers, beings from heaven who looked down at earth and crossed a line. In the Book of Jubilees, the story of the Watchers isn't just myth or folklore, it's recorded like history, assigned to a moment, anchored in time. These Watchers weren't evil at first. They were heavenly beings, sent to guide humanity. But something changed. They saw the daughters of men, and instead of staying in their heavenly roles, they descended. Jubilees tells us this wasn't a spontaneous event. It was a coordinated rebellion. The descent of the Watchers is dated. Their sin is recorded. Even their punishment is structured. It all fits within the divine calendar. And the result? Something terrifying. From this unnatural union came the giants, called Nephilim, beings of enormous size, unmatched strength, and uncontrolled rage. They devoured all that humans could produce, and when the food ran out, they turned on the people themselves. These giants weren't just physical monsters, they were symbols of corruption, proof that when divine order is broken, the earth itself bleeds. But here's where it gets more haunting. The Book of Jubilees claims these giants didn't just die out. When they were destroyed, their spirits remained. Disembodied, restless, and hostile. And these spirits, Jubilee says, became what we now call demons. That's right. The demonic presence tormenting humanity throughout history wasn't created by God. It was born from a mistake, from an invasion, from a merging of realms that was never supposed to happen. In this version of the fall, the corruption of the earth wasn't just Adam and Eve's fault. It wasn't just human disobedience. It was the result of a celestial betrayal. A heavenly order was broken, and earth became the battlefield. And unlike the brief references in Genesis, Jubilees doesn't whisper this. It documents it. The descent, the offspring, the destruction, the aftermath, all logged in sacred time. Even the punishment of the Watchers is marked. Some are bound under the earth. Others are cast into dark places. And one, Mastema, the leader, is allowed to remain, to test, to tempt, to play the role of adversary. Sound familiar? It should, because in many ways, Mastema is the Jubilees version of Satan, but with a twist. He isn't acting on his own. He's permitted, regulated, used as a tool of judgment. The fall in Jubilees is not chaos, it's consequence. And when you understand that, when you realize that every moment of rebellion and justice is placed deliberately, the world starts to look different. Nothing is random, not even evil. It's as if heaven has an accountant, and every act, every fall, every rise is logged in the books. This view does show something powerful. It reframes sin not as something wild and unpredictable, but as something that ripples through time with precision. Adam's exile, Cain's murder, the Watcher's descent, the giant's terror, the demons that followed. Each one falls on a date, each one has a weight. And the Book of Jubilees tells us, if you know the timeline, you'll know the lesson. You'll know why judgment comes. You'll know when mercy is offered. And you'll understand that even in our worst moments, someone was keeping track. Someone who knew this world needed more than forgiveness. It needed structure. That's why in Jubilees, the law isn't just given to control, it's given to heal. Because time, if used well, can cleanse what was broken. But only if we listen, only if we remember the rhythm. And as we move to the next section, that rhythm continues, because the fall didn't just stain the earth, it shaped the generations that followed. And one family would carry both the memory of the giants and the hope of redemption. That's where we go next. There's something strange about the Book of Jubilees. It doesn't just tell stories, it predicts them. It doesn't just speak of ancient people, it looks forward and warns. And if you read it closely, really closely, you'll find something deeply unsettling. It knew what was coming, not just in vague symbols or poetic riddles, but in actual cycles of time. Generations mapped out, kingdoms rising, nations falling, and most chilling of all, a final reckoning. But this wasn't included in the Bible, not the one most people read. Why? Why were these prophecies, which echo both Enoch and the Book of Revelation, quietly left behind? Let's start with what Jubilees actually does. It divides history into Jubilees, periods of 49 years, 7 times 7, a sacred rhythm, and in that rhythm, time becomes a sacred map. Events don't just happen randomly, they fall into place, like gears turning inside a divine clock. The book tells us the future was already written, not in mystery, but in math. According to Jubilees, there is an end. And that end isn't just some sudden apocalypse. It's the final cycle of time, long set in motion. And just like the Book of Enoch, Jubilees speaks of heavenly tablets, divine records where everything is written, the deeds of nations, the rise of evil, the final judgment. These tablets weren't just symbols. They were described as real, kept in the hands of angels, recording every act, every intention. Jubilees describes a world moving toward one moment, when heaven would no longer just watch, but intervene. Now, if you're familiar with Revelation, the beasts, the seals, the trumpet blasts, you'll notice something. Jubilees has its own version. It speaks of a final generation, one that would ignore the laws, break the covenant, and corrupt time itself. In that generation, evil would disguise itself as wisdom. Nations would wage war, not for truth, but for power. And the earth itself would groan under the weight of it. Does that sound familiar? It should, because the echoes of Jubilees sound louder today than they did centuries ago. It says there will be a people who forget the sacred times, forget the divine patterns, forget who they are. And when memory fades, so does protection. Jubilees warns that in this time, even the righteous will suffer, but not without purpose, because that suffering, it's part of a refinement, a test, a separation, a preparation. For what comes next is not just destruction, but renewal. The book hints at a moment when the veil between worlds begins to lift, when the watchers rise again, when the scrolls are open, and when a great light returns to judge what was hidden. It's not just about the end, it's about what the end reveals. And here's the part that many miss. Jubilees doesn't say that evil wins. It says evil will appear to win. For a moment, for a season. But in the rhythm of divine time, even deception has a deadline. Because the final Jubilee, that's not wrath. That's restoration. The return to what was lost. The garden, the harmony, the presence of the divine walking again with man. And those heavenly tablets, they're opened, not just to angels, but to us, to read, to remember, to reclaim the truth. This is why the Book of Jubilees was buried. Not because it was heresy, but because it was dangerous. It didn't just tell people to believe, it told them when to wake up. And when people know the time, they stop waiting and they start preparing. As you hold this knowledge, you might feel the weight of it, like a whisper from a forgotten world calling you to remember what was lost and what's coming. Because some prophecies weren't meant to be read in comfort. They were meant to shake you, to wake you. And that moment, it's closer than we think. Let's ask the question no one wants to answer directly. Why did the Book of Jubilees vanish from the Bible most people read? The official reason, according to scholars, is simple. It wasn't canon. It didn't fit the criteria. It wasn't endorsed by the right councils in the right era with the right politics. But is that really why? Because when you dig deeper, beneath the polite academic explanations and historical footnotes, you find something unsettling. The Book of Jubilees wasn't just a different version of Genesis. It was a reconstruction, a retelling, and more importantly, a retiming of the entire biblical narrative. It rewrote the calendar. It mapped out events in fixed intervals. It claimed that God's plan followed a strict, sacred timeline, one that could be known, tracked, and even predicted. And that changes everything. Because if time isn't random, if prophecy is mathematical, then nothing in history is an accident. That's dangerous. Dangerous to institutions, dangerous to interpretations, dangerous to those who prefer power over prophecy. You see, Jubilees doesn't just tell us what happened. It tells us when it happened and when it will happen again. That kind of knowledge doesn't just inform, it disrupts. It suggests that there is a hidden rhythm behind everything, a divine clock ticking quietly behind every empire, every collapse, every rise of evil, and every return of light. That's not just theological, it's revolutionary. And maybe that's why it had to go. But there's more. The Book of Jubilees reintroduces a cast of characters that many wanted buried. It speaks of angels who taught forbidden knowledge. It revives the story of the Watchers, of Enoch, of giants born of heaven and earth. It connects human rebellion not just to sin, but to corrupted instruction from celestial beings. And what does that do? It shifts the blame. It complicates the story. It suggests humanity wasn't just falling, it was pushed by beings once trusted, beings now erased. And Jubilees doesn't stop there. It declares that all of this, every age, every fall, every restoration, was written on heavenly tablets long before any of it happened. In other words, nothing is random. Everything is recorded. Every secret act is known. And when the final Jubilee arrives, it will all be revealed. That's not just uncomfortable, it's uncontrollable. And to those who want to preserve a clean, orderly, manageable faith, a version of Scripture that doesn't threaten the power of nations or the structure of churches, the Book of Jubilees is a problem. So, what do you do with a problem like that? You bury it. You call it non-canonical. You leave it out of the Bible, and over time, people forget, but some didn't forget. The Ethiopian church kept it. Scholars studied it in the shadows, and those who searched for hidden truths found it again. And here's the chilling part. When you compare what Jubilees predicted, its timelines, its prophecies, its patterns, to the world we live in now, it doesn't feel ancient. It feels current. It reads less like an old myth and more like a coded warning from a lost civilization, a voice from a scroll no one was supposed to open again. So ask yourself, was it really erased because it was unimportant? Or was it erased because it was too true? Because some books comfort, others control, but the rarest ones, they awaken. And awakening is dangerous to those who profit from sleep. So now we're left with a haunting thought. What if the Book of Jubilees was right all along? What if history isn't just a series of random events, but a divine pattern, a cosmic rhythm written long before we were born? Because if that's true, then everything we know about the Bible's timeline needs to be re-examined. What we've been taught to believe as coincidence may actually be part of a sacred countdown. Maybe the wars, the empires, the shifts in power, they aren't just human choices or historical cycles. Maybe they're milestones, ticking off across a calendar we were never meant to see. A calendar erased, but not lost. The Book of Jubilees speaks of heavenly tablets. It says the future was written before time began, that every act of justice, every fall, every redemption is already set in motion. It doesn't speak with fear. It speaks with certainty, and that's why it was buried. Because certainty is dangerous when it doesn't serve power. But here we are, digging up what was meant to stay hidden, opening a book that was never supposed to be opened again. And the question we're left with isn't whether it's true. It's whether we're ready to see the Bible not as a closed book, but as a layered message, ready to admit that what we've been told is complete, might only be a piece, ready to trace the pattern, not just the story, because once you see the rhythm, you can't unsee it. And once you realize that time itself may be part of the message, you begin to wonder what's next. What part of the divine timeline are we in right now? And what chapter is still waiting to unfold? If you've made it this far, then maybe, just maybe, you were meant to remember.